0,001. Imagine waking up one day to find out that your morning cup of coffee costs 5 times more than it did yesterday. Your paycheck remains the same, but everything else seems to be getting more expensive day by day. This is the reality for millions of Americans as they grapple with the harsh consequences of inflation. But what exactly is inflation, and why does it matter? Welcome to The Money Trail, your go-to source for uncovering the hidden truths about our financial history. 0,024 inflation is a complex economic phenomenon that affects us all in subtle yet profound ways. At its core, inflation represents the overall rise in prices for goods and services in an economy over time. The Bureau of Labor Statistics measures this change through something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Every month, thousands of workers across the country gather data on the cost of various items, from groceries and housing to transportation and medical care. Session 2054 to calculate inflation, these experts compare today's prices with those from a specific base year, often set at 100. For instance, if the price of milk increases from 3 in the base year to 360 set today, we would say that the price of milk has risen by 20%. The CPI then aggregates these individual changes into a single number, reflecting the average percentage increase in prices for a typical basket of goods and services. Session 1023. But here's where things get interesting. While the CPI provides an important snapshot of price trends, it doesn't always align with our personal experiences. This discrepancy arises due to differences between the market basket used in the calculation and what we actually buy. For some, inflation might feel much higher if they spend a larger share of their income on items experiencing rapid price increases. 0,01522. So why should you care about inflation? Well, for starters, it erodes your purchasing power. As prices rise, each dollar buys less and less. Moreover, inflation affects various aspects of our lives, from interest rates and investment returns to government policies and social welfare programs. 0,0002017. In the coming episodes, we'll dive deep into the world of inflation, exposing its inner workings and uncovering surprising connections to our daily lives. Stay tuned as The Money Trail continues to reveal the untold stories behind your money. 0,002-118. To truly understand inflation, we must first examine how it's officially calculated. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is the primary tool used to measure inflation in the United States. Developed by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the CPI is a complex statistical system that calculates the changing prices of a basket of goods and services over time. 0,002-0,045. The calculation of the CPI begins with a specific set of goods and services known as the market basket. This basket includes items such as food, housing, clothing, transportation, medical care, and recreation, the things that most households typically purchase. The BLS meticulously tracks the prices of these items over time, using data from thousands of retailers and service providers across the country. 0,003-012, however, not all items in the market basket are given equal weight. Instead, they're assigned specific weights based on their importance to the average household budget. For example, housing costs typically make up a larger portion of the CPI than recreation expenses, reflecting their greater significance in most people's lives. 0,003-036. Here's where things get interesting. Over time, the composition of the market basket changes to keep pace with shifts in consumer spending patterns. Every few years, the BLS conducts a comprehensive survey known as the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which collects data on what Americans are buying and how much they're spending. Based on these findings, the BLS updates the market basket to ensure that it accurately reflects contemporary consumption habits. 0,04005. But here's the twist. Because the market basket changes over time, the CPI isn't strictly measuring apples-to-apples price changes. Instead, it's comparing the cost of today's market basket to that of a previous period, a methodology known as chain weighting. While this approach allows the CPI to remain relevant, it also introduces potential distortions and complications into the calculation process. 00, 1004, 1000, 1000, and 1000, and 4000, 1000. This official method of calculating inflation doesn't always align with what people experience in their daily lives. But before we delve into those discrepancies, it's essential to understand how the CPI is constructed and why it matters. 00, 1000, 4000, 1032. When it comes to calculating inflation, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is the primary tool used by economists and policymakers. However, this official method isn't without its fair share of criticisms and controversies. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, is responsible for calculating the CPI, which they do by tracking the prices of a basket of goods and services over time. This basket includes things like food, housing, clothing, transportation, and medical care. The BLS then uses these prices to calculate the cost of this basket in different periods, comparing the total cost over time to determine the rate of inflation. However, some critics argue that the way the BLS constructs this basket of goods doesn't accurately reflect the real-world spending patterns of consumers. For example, the BLS assigns equal weights to all items in the basket, regardless of how much money people actually spend on those items. This means that a small increase in the price of a rarely purchased item could have the same weight as a more significant increase in the price of a frequently purchased item, such as rent or groceries. Another criticism of the CPI is that it doesn't adequately account for changes in the quality of goods and services over time. For example, if the price of a particular car increases from one year to the next, the CPI would record this as inflation. However, if the new model of that car has more features or is made with higher quality materials than the previous year's model, the CPI might not accurately reflect the value that consumers are getting for their money. These criticisms have led some economists to develop alternative measures of inflation, such as the chain-weighted CPI and the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index. These alternative measures attempt to address some of the shortcomings of the traditional CPI by using more sophisticated methods to calculate the cost of the basket of goods and services. Despite these criticisms, the CPI remains the most widely used measure of inflation in the United States. However, as we'll see in future episodes, this official method doesn't always align with what people experience in their daily lives. Understanding the limitations and controversies surrounding the CPI is essential for making informed decisions about how to manage your money and plan for the future. As we've discovered, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is the primary tool used to measure inflation in the United States. However, not everyone agrees with the way it's calculated or the accuracy of its results. One prominent critic is John Williams, a renowned economist who founded Shadow Government Statistics, also known as ShadowStats. ShadowStats is an alternative economic data and analysis service that recalculates key government statistics, such as the CPI, using older methodologies. According to Williams, these outdated methods more accurately reflect people's everyday experiences with inflation. For instance, before 1980, the Bureau of Labor Statistics used a geometric mean formula to calculate the CPI, which takes into account the fact that consumers often shift their spending toward cheaper goods when prices rise. However, in 1980, the BLS switched to an arithmetic mean formula, which assumes that people's consumption patterns remain constant regardless of price changes, a decision that Williams argues significantly understates inflation. ShadowStats uses a pre-1980 methodology to calculate its alternative CPI, resulting in figures that are consistently higher than the official CPI. For example, as of 2021, while the BLS reports an annual CPI increase of around 2%, ShadowStats calculates an inflation rate of over 9%. This stark discrepancy has raised concerns among some economists and policymakers who worry that relying on the official CPI may lead to underestimating the true impact of inflation on households, businesses, and the broader economy. It's important to note that ShadowStats is not without its own critics, who argue that its alternative measures are overly pessimistic and rely on outdated assumptions about consumer behavior. Nevertheless, the existence of these alternative calculations highlights the ongoing debate surrounding inflation measurement and underscores the importance of understanding the potential limitations of official statistics when making financial decisions. In our next episode, we'll explore how different inflation measures can lead to contrasting economic policies and outcomes, and what that means for your wallet. So join us as we continue to follow the money trail. As we delve deeper into the complex world of inflation measurement, it's crucial to examine how changes in the Consumer Price Index calculation have evolved over time. The CPI is the most widely used measure of inflation, and understanding its evolution can help us grasp why there might be a discrepancy between official statistics and our personal financial experiences. The origins of the CPI can be traced back to the late 19th century, when the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics began collecting data on the prices of various goods and services. However, it wasn't until the 1920s that the BLS developed a formal method for calculating the CPI, which was initially called the Cost of Living Index. At this time, the CPI only considered the expenditures of urban blue-collar workers, but over the years it expanded to include other demographics, such as rural households and white-collar workers. In 1961, amid concerns about rising inflation, President John F. Kennedy appointed a commission on money and credit, which recommended significant changes to the CPI calculation. The commission advocated for the use of geometric means instead of arithmetic means, arguing that it would provide a more accurate reflection of actual spending patterns. This change was implemented in 1998, but by then, another important modification had already taken place, the introduction of owner's equivalent rent in 1983. The OER replaced the previous method of calculating housing costs based on actual expenditures for renters and imputed rents for homeowners. The new approach was intended to better capture changes in house prices, but it also had the effect of reducing overall inflation rates since homeowners typically face lower cost increases than renters. These modifications to the CPI calculation have not gone without controversy. Critics argue that these adjustments have led to an underestimation of real-world inflation, thereby skewing policymakers' perceptions and decisions on issues such as interest rates and Social Security benefits. In our next episode, we'll explore how different measures of inflation can lead to contrasting economic policies and outcomes, and what that means for your wallet. So join us as we continue to follow the money trail. As we've discovered, the way inflation is calculated doesn't always align with what people experience in their daily lives. This disconnect can have serious real-world implications, affecting families, businesses, and even government policy. Consider Mary, a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Over the past year, she's noticed that her grocery bills have been steadily rising, but when she hears official reports stating that inflation is low, she can't help but feel confused and frustrated. The truth is, the cost of food, something Mary buys every day, has risen faster than the overall rate of inflation. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from 2018 to 2019, food prices increased by 2.0%, outpacing the overall inflation rate of 1.8% during that same period. For Mary and millions like her, this difference is significant and can mean the choice between putting food on the table or paying other essential bills. Now let's look at small business owners, like John, who runs a local hardware store in Des Moines, Iowa. He's seen the cost of supplies increase year after year, but when he tries to pass those costs on to his customers through higher prices, they start shopping online where prices may be lower. As a result, John is forced to absorb some of those increased costs himself, which can make it difficult for him to turn a profit or even stay in business. And what about retirees relying on Social Security benefits? In 2019, the average monthly benefit was $1,471, providing crucial support for millions of Americans. However, since 1982, the cost of living adjustment for these benefits has been tied to the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, which may not accurately reflect the expenses faced by seniors. According to a study from the Senior Citizens League, between 2000 and 2021, the purchasing power of Social Security benefits declined by over 30%. This means that many retirees are finding it increasingly difficult to make ends meet, despite receiving regular COLA increases. These real-world examples highlight the importance of accurately measuring inflation, not just for policymakers, but for everyday people trying to navigate their financial lives. In our next episode, we'll explore how different measures of inflation can lead to contrasting economic policies and outcomes, and what that means for your wallet. So join us as we continue to follow the money trail. As we've seen, inflation can be a complicated issue, affecting people's lives in ways that may not always be immediately apparent. To better understand the true cost of living increase, let's hear from some experts in the field. Lisa Dedling, a senior economist at the Federal Reserve, explains that, while official inflation rates are important, they don't always capture the full picture of what people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives. She points to factors such as housing costs and healthcare expenses, which can rise much faster than the overall rate of inflation. Meanwhile, Mark J. Perry, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, argues that inflation is often overstated, particularly when it comes to measures like the Consumer Price Index. He notes that the CPI doesn't take into account improvements in product quality or technological innovation, which can actually lower costs for consumers. But other experts warn that underestimating inflation can be just as dangerous as overstating it. When policymakers rely on inaccurate measures of inflation, it can lead to bad decisions that hurt ordinary people, says Dr. Jared Bernstein, a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He cites the example of Social Security benefits, which are tied to the CPI but may not keep pace with actual increases in the cost of living. So what's the solution? Some experts advocate for using multiple measures of inflation in order to capture a more complete picture of the economic landscape. Others argue for more transparency and accountability in the way that inflation is calculated and reported. But whatever approach we take, one thing is clear: inflation is a critical issue that affects us all. As Dr. Dedling puts it, inflation isn't just a number on a page, it's a real force that shapes people's lives in profound ways. And if we want to make smart decisions about our economic future, we need to understand it as fully and accurately as possible. As we continue to follow the money trail, we'll explore these issues in more depth and shine a light on the hidden financial forces that shape our world. 300 words. As we've discovered on our journey through the money trail, inflation is a complex and multifaceted issue. It's not just a dry economic statistic, it's a real force that impacts people's lives in tangible ways. And as our expert, Dr. James Smith from the University of Chicago points out, the way we measure inflation can have significant consequences for individuals, businesses, and even entire economies. Despite its importance, however, the way we calculate inflation is often at odds with people's lived experiences. The Consumer Price Index, the most commonly used measure of inflation, only takes into account a fixed basket of goods and services. This means that it doesn't account for changes in consumption patterns or new products coming to market. As a result, the CPI may not fully capture the true impact of inflation on people's wallets. Moreover, as we've seen, there are many other factors that can influence inflation, from government policies and global economic trends to supply chain disruptions and natural disasters. These factors can be difficult to measure and quantify, making it even more challenging to accurately calculate inflation. But the stakes are high. Misleading inflation figures can lead to poor policy decisions, misallocation of resources, and ultimately, a less stable economy. That's why it's crucial that we continue to explore and scrutinize the way we measure inflation, and push for greater transparency and accountability in the process. As we move forward, let us remember that inflation is not just a number on a page, it's a real force that shapes people's lives in profound ways. And if we want to make smart decisions about our economic future, we need to understand it as fully and accurately as possible. In the words of Dr. Tauntability as possible, Smith, we owe it to ourselves and future generations to get this right, and to ensure that our measures of inflation are truly reflective of the world we live in. Thank you for joining us on The Money Trail. We'll continue to follow the twists and turns of the financial world, uncovering hidden truths, exposing questionable practices, and shining a light on the complex forces that shape our economy. Stay tuned for more.